There is a radio station in this universe broadcasting on a frequency to which your mind is not naturally tuned. On the other hand, all swine pick up on the hog reports. You're just jealous. The collective progress of man could be described as each person doing and being the best they can in areas not necessary for physical survival. It is here that human institutions come into play by presenting apparent guidance in this effort. Those wishing to pursue individual evolution must find their own direction. The speaker addressed the crowd. Your thinking is different if you're lying down, sitting down, or standing up. And someone in the audience asked, how much different? And the lecturer replied, well, actually not much, but just enough for me to have something to say. The prince of one mythical order would sometimes look down from his window at the knights in the courtyard waiting and wonder just how much they understood of what he had told them regarding their charge and the great undertaking. And just then an orderly came in with his breakfast of gruel when he had asked for bread and cheese. A quick-footed man can get out of the way of anything except his own thoughts. That requires proficiency in five-dimensional terpsichore. One of the grave irritations suffered by one man who, for most of his life, had dreamed of finding and riding the great mythical express was in his increasing realization of how easy it was to ride the everyday commuter train. Fact, if you never think about being here, guess what? You never will be. There are two ways of looking at anything, and one way of looking at that, which is to say that two ways are enough of looking at anything. The actual sight of the mythical night doesn't see conflicts, men, or trees, but sees. Thoughts can either be liberating or confining, and if you take your naturally occurring ones as being your own, they'll always be the latter. A certain monk in a certain monastery spent most of his days in its library, reading and writing in areas metaphysical, secure in his rightfully founded impression that, by so doing, he could ward off having to face a certain fact. As the conductor walked by, a passenger tugged at his sleeve and asked, does anyone actually know where this train is headed? And the uniformed one replied, well, even if they do and you don't, what difference does it make? And with these words, the passenger was greatly relieved. Not. One man had an animal that would run through his house. Sometimes he would see it, and sometimes he wouldn't. He only saw it when he remembered to see it. Some men enjoy stories like this more than other men do. Hardly anyone enjoys such stories. Local reality reassured a group of momentarily disturbed people. Look, if you have thoughts, you're conscious. That's it. Now go on about your business and don't worry about it. Is it any wonder that life pays reality so well? Fate. What you get when you're not fully conscious. The more an organization or institution is at great pains to explain just what is its core purpose, the further removed it is from any resembling a pertinent personal one. A tale of bowel-quivering ramifications. One man became so smart that it was more than was good for him. And presto, whammo even, his hand grabbed itself, his lips bit his mouth, and out in the yard a tree climbed itself. I don't know, maybe it's gotten to the point that you guys will believe any old story, even when it's told backwards. Query, what fleas bad rap the bulk of elephants other than Schwarzenegger wannabes? You ever notice waiting doesn't have a damn bit? See, I knew that. You either get them or you don't. Do they get most of them? I won't go into that. On one world, there are 5 major thought categories which parallel the 5 major food groups. And to show you how far behind they are in universal evolution, it was only last year that they finally developed anti-gravitational technology. I couldn't resist. I thought maybe it would help this time. No matter what year it is, the woods are still dominated by the simple. Monasteries and the secluded life. Would-be mystics have historically retired from life when they find they're unable to retire from themselves. Ad seen in the neural personal column, quoting, "Mind seeks thoughts for a lasting relationship. Must be quiet type. Really quiet." Each man is naturally as intelligent as life needs him to be. The defect in letting other people tell you what it would take to make you a better person is that they don't know. Humor and conclusiveness. Everything without an ending has a punchline. Seemingly. Every speeding train has a conductor whose job it is to try and make the tracks ignore what's going on. His name is thoughts. It's not just a matter of it being nearly impossible to get people interested in efforts that are not in any way necessary, but it's also nearly impossible to make the efforts even if you get them interested. But it's also nearly impossible to get them to make the efforts even if you get them interested. In this human circus, high wire and other balancing acts know which parts to make more popular and which ones to make less so. Even amongst potentially real mystical explorers, the foggy conditions of local reality is such that it normally takes half a lifetime just to be sure that you're actually on track. Those of ordinary simple mind can be fooled both by the complex and by the simple. One view of the supreme conspiracy is how life keeps man from mentioning the obvious. You're never a complete success in the city unless you note how along the way you were abused, misused, not understood, and underappreciated. Enter hunting and the efficiency of ociousness. Common men began to collect trophy heads to adorn their walls once the predominance of redundancy became glaringly apparent. Pharmaceutical news. Some now suspect that thought without bias would be like drugs without narcotics. More specifically, is one in the field who says that thought without bias might in fact no longer be thought. How about an even wider consideration? Does the power of thought come from its myopic bias or from its blindingly swift vicissitude? What the neurolocomotive experts insist on ignoring is the fact that you cannot study a train until you first bring it under control and stop it. I didn't say stare at it, I said stop it. Oh, I'm sorry. According to legend, there was once a knight engaged in the great mythical quest who, after years of battles, conflicts, and intrigues, stopped and pondered. Is the actual difficulty of this endeavor due to how hard it is to do, or how easy it is not to? Theatrics. You either got it or you don't. One man was so stupid that he didn't want to talk about it. His brother was so smart that he too kept silent. And their third sibling was so all-consuming and unselective that the first two finally ceased to exist. Anyone who tells you that it is difficult to live a mystical inner life has no idea what it's actually all about. One man asked his thoughts, "What do you think?" And as soon as he did, they didn't. One man became tired of the land in which he lived and began to make up imaginary new ones. He enjoyed them so much that he began telling others about them. And soon, after he began such telling, he grew weary of them also. A knight once asked the king, "What are the dangers of talk?" And his liege replied, "What are not?" If living by the thoughts life naturally provides for you is a scripted existence, consider where that tosses the whole concept of individual originality. Speculative game time. By whose hand do you think a true mystical warrior would prefer to die? A simple, unthinking barbarian or a more sophisticated pretender to intelligence? Written epitaphs on physical headstones tell only the tales of routine lives. The simple, foolproof, totally unpopular way to tell if you are stupid. You keep thinking the same thoughts. This, of course, being the same test to determine if you're sane. One day, a certain knight sat down and tried to figure out just how much time he had actually spent at home and how much away. And him having never traveled outside the castle walls. Everybody has a favorite joke, but most people don't know what it is. And even if they did, they wouldn't know why it is. Ordinary men do combat with countless foes. A mystic knight with only one. And P.S. It is not himself, not in some psychological sense. For a long time, one man would often hesitate. Later on, he hoped he hadn't done this too often. One day, while lying beside a lake in the woods, a knight was approached by a dragon who said to him, "Is not just being alive at times tiring?" And the knight admitted thereto. And the dragon continued, "Is not trying to figure out what life is all about also often trying?" And again the knight agreed, and on pressed the dragon. "Then why expend more effort than you have to on your mythical quest?" And although this time he did not reply, just having the question so bluntly laid in his face rejuvenated the knight. And he continued to lie there, but now with his attention to the aim reestablished and focused. With those to the quest born, not making the needed effort is what is truly exhaustive and depleting. Although not judged so by routine standards, still, mysticism is the supreme intellectual achievement. For those who have discovered life head on and peered directly into the face of the secret itself, thus knowing forever the nature of what it is they must now do, the meaning of efficiency is melted down to one simple thing: do it. You could look, I gave another view tonight of the idea of conspiracies, even though I have on my own given you possibilities of the ultimate conspiracy. Well, I've told you outright what the ultimate, the supreme conspiracy is, and that is simply life. That's it. But somewhere between here and there, which makes very little sense to people at the ordinary intellectual level, between here and there I can keep coming up with certain sub-views. Views between, in the areas between here and there. And so I can say another view of the supreme conspiracy is how life prohibits man, hinders man, keeps man from noting the obvious. This conspiracy is, I could go into it in such depth, and remember this very shortly. As far as people interested in this, as far as it being a conspiracy out there in life, yeah, so what? This place is going to rain tomorrow. The real importance of it is how it is reflected inside the human nervous system, inside of you individually, which is much harder to directly point to. Hence, the apparent, though flabby, temporary, and grossly of odiousness, external examples. But another view of the supreme conspiracy is how life will inhibit man to keep man from noting the obvious. I could pick out examples now. I could go back. It'd be better now, but I was going to say it's always been true. It's nothing new. But there are things going on in life that are just as obvious as hell. And I'm talking about just crude everyday examples, and I'm not even going to spell them out. At least people get any encouragement to go along in their own automatic folly. But there are things going on in life in every part of the world. Right here in Yugoslavia, as we all know, as if we could ignore it. In other parts of the world, the U.S., Brazil, even Ecuador, sometimes Norway, All over the world, there are things going on. I'm talking about in what appears to be, are you ready, out there in the world. Ordinary, social, civic, artistic, governmental, but normally be called social, the social climate, the conditions of each place. There are things going on that men cannot, when I say men now, I'm talking about the mainstream of life, those that apparently run the local conditions, that run the local cities, the spokesmen, the apparent thinkers, the leaders, etc. Not that there won't be fringe people always screaming insults to some group and trying to lay social blame somewhere. But the point is, there's things going on all over the world. And this, by the way, there's a graduation here that the more civilized is the area, the more the conspiracy is in effect. To wit, if you got into areas right now, if we found some secluded island where they were just barely into the literate age, and a little out of the Stone Age, there's no such thing as social restraint. There's no such thing as political correctness. There's no such thing as sensitivities for others' feelings. And it doesn't have to be just a deserted island. It can be in certain parts of Alabama and Mississippi and upper state New York. But the more that you're in an area that is not just overall mechanically in the forefront, or at least in the mainstream of societal evolution, the easier it is for them to escape this conspiracy. And everything being equal again, the less importance they play at all in the general overall scheme. And it's as though life says, well, you know, who cares? Mm-hmm. That it can afford to have some stray dogs nipping at the tires, if life had tires, and I'm not saying it does. I got too close last time talking about life could be a film, and I said, no, I'm not saying that. It was just an example, and I saw several people started whipping out notebooks, and I had to try and cover it. So I'm not saying absolutely that life does have tires. It's just it could be a figure of speech. Life can abide the fringes nipping at its feet. That's why they are the fringes. It all works out. It's another part of the obviousness, by the way. I keep pointing it out, and it's so obvious that people don't even notice it. But that would be a splendid example, if it was easier to talk about, of exactly what I'm talking about. But since it is an even more difficult and vague, obtuse example of what I'm talking about, which is vague and obtuse enough to start with, I don't think I'll use an example that I have already pre-mentioned. I have already pre-cooked it and identified it as being extremely, unusually vague and obtuse, and therefore we will not stick with the example I just mentioned, if you remember what it was, and that is that life can abide these stray examples of people actually, in a sense, pointing out the obvious, but they are always labeled as crackpots, fringe element, hate mongers, just yucky people, but normally fringe element and crackpots has always been. And that's the way it should be. But that does not belie the fact of what they're pointing out. Now, having said that, now let's go back to the way reality works. It does belie it. Because somebody says, well, I know what's wrong about a certain area. It's this group of people, or it's certain kinds of people, or it's that group. And they'll identify somebody and say, well, it's mainly them doing it. And the more civilized, in the very mechanical sense, the more the people, the more the area is being driven by to the level of consciousness and above, that is not, the more it is into the intellectual area as being its foremost motivator, as opposed to being simply physical survival needs, the more it is being driven up here, the less tolerance the people will have for somebody going, oh, well, it's these people's fault. It could be true as hell. And it's always been true. That you just look and you go, well, that's true. And life will not allow it. Unless it's into an area that they're so uncivilized, that the whole area is so fringe anyway, that's what I meant, is they can get by with it. But the more you get into the areas wherein man is en masse progressing, that he is collectively, just look at it as a scale as always, it's not just this or that. But the more that the mainstream, the more the areas, which nowadays includes most of the world, it's just what's normally known as the first and second world, the developed, the technological, the industrial, most of the world now, that in the major metropolitan areas of most of the world, there are certain things that cannot be tolerated. It's nothing new, but it continues to be so, that are just obvious as hell, and life will not allow men to point it out. So without me going into details, which it doesn't matter, I could pick them out now as easy as you could, and I bet you're already going, well, I can think of, it's always been true. But now the question is why? And you've got to be, of course, a complete snicker brain to think, well, it has something to do with the innate need for men to be moral and decent to their fellow man. Get a brain. I know that's what ordinary people say. And, God bless them, as we non-ordinary people say. Because you always encourage people on in their folly as long as it's good for the community as a whole and might keep danger away from your doorstep. Is God bless you, folks. Keep up the good work. Well, same way you would an exterminator if you had termites. Let's go ahead. The question is, has everybody followed the setup? Because this is just true as hell, and I know ordinary people would hear this and their mind just goes off on a tangent, or I start getting these letters again. I knew that you had some kind of secret agenda and you just won't say it outright. I'm sorry. That's how secret it is. But there are things that go on in life that you can turn around under isolated conditions at any given time. Now, 5,000 years ago, and there'll be something going on that the collective says, that the society, the civilization goes, well, here's a problem. It could be crime, let's say. And they'll say, well, what's causing the crime? And if you looked around, it's one group of people. It might be slaves that they took in, some group that they conquered 50 years ago. I'm just trying to give you some example. So that somebody can explain it away. But the point is, they will not tolerate from the mainstream. If they're civilized in the mainstream of normal evolution, of somebody turn around and say, well, I'm not sure I got a solution, but you're saying why we got crime. It's these people, the ones that we conquered, and we suckered them in here, made them, our house slaves, and the other one's giving us trouble. No. Of course, it's now getting sort of oxymoronical, because if they were more civilized, they wouldn't have slaves, you understand. But somebody will come up with a response to it's the point. They'll say, well, it's this group. And somebody will say, yeah, but there's a reason for it. There are things about life that you cannot specifically note. The more civilized is the area. Not only out there, but out there you can't. So now, assuming you know exactly what I'm talking about, the question would be why? And don't go, well, God bless everybody's little soul and everybody needs a chance. Why? You know why? It would inhibit continued mechanical evolution. Because life is not going to let things stay like that. And it does no ordinary mind any good to, as they would put it, to absolutely lay blame at somebody's doorstep and say, well, it's their fault. Now, the fringe elements always try to, and the fringe elements are always of the more simplistic. They're always those who are intellectually driven at the bare minimum, wherever it is, whenever it is. And they will be the ones who will do it. They're the ones who will stand up and go, well, hey, I tell you people, the mayor gets up and makes some speech about re-elect me because crime is now increasing at such a rate. If you don't have me, oh, you lucky people, if you don't re-elect me, God knows what will happen to your families and property. No. Because it is such a widespread problem, you need somebody like me. We're going to have to set up all sorts of programs. We're going to do all this. And some crackpot, they're going to take questions. There's some guy in the audience. Don't let me call him a crackpot yet. They'll do that. And he'll talk about all these kind of social programs that we need. We need to set up committees to study the problem of why, suddenly in our midst, why crime is taking on this kind of... So he gets through questions and answers. And some guy in the audience says, what the hell are you talking about? All that bullshit, and you won't say what it is. It's those people doing it. All we got to do is get rid of them. What has that man identified himself as? Well, to begin with, remember, look at the justice of how life is arranged. The only people who will do that will be, I'm just using ordinary terminology, uneducated, simplistic, fringe elements, but from most people's view now, ordinary view, they would be the uneducated, the underclass. And they would say, well, this man is he's trying now to stir up some kind of hate monger and get some group. Nobody addressed the fact that, yeah, that's who's doing it. You understand? And it's not humans knowing what they're doing. It's that life will not allow it. It never has allowed it. But it works out beautifully, you understand. If somebody was standing there, let's say somebody, just a middle-class voter standing there, and this guy stands up. Obviously, an uneducated peckerwood, a redneck, a rube, a guy, you can just look at him, and you wouldn't want to sit next to him on a bus, which is the only thing he could ride. You just look at him. Before he says anything, hey, this is not going to fly. He says, why are you giving us all that stuff, all you politicians, that double talk? I'll tell you who's causing crime, and he points out to some group of people, and he says it's them. Now, rather than anybody even have to deal with the fact that it's obvious as hell. Everybody knows that's them. But you can't note that. That is not the way life works. So, I'm just doing to show you how it goes on, the balance in your own mind. That you have a brother that's too smart for his own good, one that's too stupid for his own good. And there's got to be a third one, or you're done for. You're going to stay a bought voter the rest of your life. So let us say that, let me pick out the third temporary possibility. There's a middle-class guy. So you understand we've got somebody that just ordinary level is sort of a figurative leader. This mayor, or guy running for president, whoever it is, a big guy, expensive suits, the background, worked his way up. Everybody on the platform, you know, if you're an ordinary person, you know that they're out of your class. You'll never get there. They got power. They probably belong to some secret club. They're probably a Mason or all kinds of weird stuff. But you know, that's just beyond me, they're our leaders. Of course, most middle-class people fall into that. I know that somebody will write a dirty letter to the editor complaining about politics, but you go out and see the same kind of people that write letters complaining and let the governor walk by, or just a councilman. And people like all submissive wolves. They'll drop their little tail between their legs and they go, oh, and they just shake his hand. And you just want to touch him, reach out and touch him. I mean, no movie stars around. Why not touch a politician? A hero. So what I'm trying to get you to see, even at the ordinary level, let's say that we've got one sort of extreme here of those who operate as figurative leaders. Those in the public eye. Right now, let's leave it at politics. Then we have a man who stands up and challenges this guy of him speaking about, well, if you re-elect me, I am going to. And he starts naming all these committees, all these studies, and he's going to set aside part of the new sales tax he's going to ask for to do nothing but increase the school system. And what we need is education. And he names all these things and talks about the whole crime thing as like kind of this vague, multi-headed monster. And we've got to have somebody of my intelligence, my insight, my determination to work on this problem from a myriad of directions to solve it. And then this Peckerwood stands up. This guy at the other end, obviously lower class. We're talking about, just like I said, everybody notices as soon as he stands. He is uneducated, simple. And he stands up and he says, why you guys always give us that double talk? We don't need any programs, we don't need anything. It's a group of people, it's one part of town, it's one section of town, or one group of people. All we got to do is go kill them all, get rid of them, and that's the end of crime. And a hush momentarily would fall on the crowd. Now, why we got this momentary hush? Because I'm just pointing out that he pointed out the observable fact, or what he pointed out was demonstratively provable. It's demonstratively true under those conditions. Now let's say right in the middle between the extreme of this figurative leader and this simplistic outcast, this fringe element. Then let's say the whole mass now of middle-class people there, those that were listening to speech, they heard this guy stand up and go, why do you give us all that double talk when we know who the problem is, we'll just get rid of them? And there are people right there in the middle class in this momentary pause and silence, I said, they know it's true. And it lasts that long because you cannot actually take note of it. So, but I was going to point out, notice, if you ever begin to see this, it is a beautiful piece of machinery. Does everybody remember a slinky that once it goes and it just keeps doing itself? But that thing's run by gravity going downhill. This machinery runs kind of, that's why I keep calling it cannibalistic and parasitic, and it plagiarizes itself. It's like a horse that gets hungry. There's this huge racing horse, and all it does is reach around and start eating on its tail and its hind legs, and it'll lead itself back up to the head and run faster. It's a beautiful piece, and it's got 3 legs. Here it is in that momentary pause, the middle class staying there, and they hear this guy say that, and it's true. But it cannot be noted. It is not part of the progressive, positive machinery of life through man. So, let's drag this out a little more. All this would happen momentarily, and he would suddenly be condemned. He would just be ridiculed and run out of the crowd. But let's expand it just for a second and get you to see how beautiful this is arranged. Since it's true what he pointed out under those limited conditions, that he says, well, hey, I tell you most of the problem, he identifies one group of people, one section of town. Of course, what's always sort of interesting is he's always in the same, more or less, general area and socioeconomic. But anyway, it always has to be somebody he can identify somewhat distant from him, of another race, another religion, another nationality. But he lives in the section next door to him. But at any rate, he points it out, and then the middle class, the middle of the parade, cannot take actual note of that. They hear it, and they know it's true. Then, if there was nothing else, until I'm about to point out, but they would then be faced with, wait a minute, since I've already pointed out to you that life is not going to tolerate men noticing that. There are all kinds of, the obvious period. It's not, I'm just picking out one example. Since life's not going to do it, then we would have all the middle class, the majority of humanity, the mainstream of life then, since life is not going to allow them to be a part of that and note it, then they would be faced, were it not for this particular aspect of it that I'm about to re-mention, they would be faced with then having to intellectually do battle with the obvious. That which I said was actually a correct observation on that guy's part. They would have to go, well, wait a minute, which sometimes they do, and they start trying to explain it away. About, well, it may be true that they're a large part of it, but there's good reason. But there's an even more efficient part at work, and that is that anybody who ever mentions that, you can depend on it, will not be part of the mainstream of life at that time and place. And so, this, as I said, it's only momentary because it hits them that that's true, and then life, nobody understands this when they're standing there. They know it's true. Of course, some of them know, ooh, I shouldn't have thought that. That's life going, watch it. They call it like guilt, but it's life going, hey. So they hear it and they know it's true, and then they also realize, wait a minute, no, we can't, no. And so rather than though having to think, well, what can I say? How can I stand and say, that's not true? He doesn't have to. Suddenly everybody just takes a moment, you look, and you realize he's not part of the sane mainstream. Therefore, you can dismiss the message because the messenger is a peckerwood. He's an outcast. He's broke. He's uneducated. He stinks. He is not part of the mainstream. But here's what I was trying to tell you about the beauty of this kind of slinky horse that runs sideways and feeds on itself. Every time that life wants something done, it's going in one direction, and it can't be done immediately. The horse has to turn around and start biting its own ass, chewing on its own tail. And somewhere between there and when it eats itself back up, which is like a whole new epoch going on, or a whole new generation, a whole new time period, by the time it eats itself back up to the ears and up to the nose and up to the lips, and it's a whole new horse, somewhere between there, beyond it turning around and starting to bite itself, to eat itself, and it's still having to run, all that period in between, there's this just almost infinite variety of human activities that cannot be noted in a direct manner because nothing is finished, and life will not allow it because it would impede. It could lend credence to the fact that people say, wait a minute, here's what's holding us back. In this case I said crime. It could be all kinds of other things, but that's the easy example. That crime, the fear of crime, etc., is keeping our civilization, our commerce, our civilization from absolutely blossoming in the way in which is potential, has a potential. And here's the problem. If they just laid on that and said, all right, it's that problem and it's some identifiable group of people, do understand that that would hinder. At first you might think, well, it would help. Because if you can actually identify the problem, you get rid of it. You can't get rid of life. Only fringe elements believe that you can get rid of life. Only fringe elements believe that by cutting out some, as they identify it, some rotten part of an apple, we'll have a new apple. It can't be done. And so this machinery is arranged to where they're in the middle between life rejuvenating itself in a specific way, in a specific area or era. Then in between that is a total conspiracy of life not letting people in that particular time and place make note of the obvious. Because to make note of the obvious is to try and nail down time, is to try and stop the ephemeral, is to try and freeze growth. I could say it is men attempting to become King Midas, that they want to touch that which is living. If you remember the story, they thought it would be a great benefit, the king did. That everything I touched would be gold since he was so greedy. But then got to the point that he turned around accidentally and patted his little girl, his favorite girl, his own little child on the head, and bang. He turned that which was viable into that which was dead, as beautiful as it was. Then people think, well, if ordinary people, and especially the fringe element, but they end up with their thoughts along similar lines but using different terminology. that if we could straighten out what I see to be the flaws right now in our contemporary day, if they would just listen to me, if I was president, if I was prime minister, if I was governor and I had the authority to just clean everything up, boy, just give me a pen, an ability, and give me a week. Now I could resign. I could straighten out our state, our country, whatever it is. Notice that doesn't happen. Notice again the beautiful machinery when people do get in power, in a position to exercise such dictatorial complete power, the tyrants of the world, what happens? Whatever they take over absolutely comes to a standstill. A tyrant, somebody can stage a coup and take over an area that could be thriving, at least running decently. Now, I assume you know this. There's no such thing as a thriving tyranny. Even if the area, a nation, some group of people, some tribe, if they were doing quite well, thriving, going right along, but they got problems. They got crime, let's say. And so finally a general, somebody, stages a coup and he forcefully takes over power on the same basis as I said that some people in so-called republics dream of. If I could just be elected just for a week and I had the authority to do it, I would straighten everything out. I'd turn everything into gold. The general, some individual can take over dictatorial absolute power and do the very things that he thought needed to be done, and which means the people might have thought needed to be done. Right? Now I've got absolute power and I'm going to straighten this nation out, this village out, this tribe out. And I'm going to straighten it out because we know what's wrong. I'm tired of, pussyfooting around. I'm going to straighten it out. You know that place is dead. And it's usually just a matter of months, because anything living cannot take that kind of dictatorial power from a normal mind, from a normal outlet. All life has done is sort of arrange for that group of people to commit suicide. Life has obviously lost interest in the way in which they were going. It lost interest in their success. It lost interest even in their minimal survival. Because anytime somebody, an ordinary man, takes over dictatorial powers, who's the only people that ever take it over, by the way, the place is done for. I wrote that again. Do you notice the beautiful justice again of this racing slinky horse, this self-consuming horse? So, but now back to, remember my picture, the middle class is staying there and they hear this guy stand up and go, well, I'll tell you what the problem is, you old politicians, you intellectuals and you people trying to double talk, just babbly-gook, because we know what the problem is. It's right there. It's those group of people. We should do something about it. And his observation, it doesn't matter who the group is, doesn't matter what the circumstance, is always there. The middle class stands there, the middle of the horse, the middle of the time it takes the horse to start eating its own tail up to its point of its own lips, swallow its mouth. For the final time, it's rejuvenated. Between here and there is like the middle class staying there, the mainstream of life going, that's true, but damn, I can't think about that. Do we have to argue it away? Do I have to explain it away? No, wait a minute. Because you look, the voice, the observation did not come there in the mainstream. You look over and it's over at the edge of the crowd. Guy with barefooted. Anyway, as I said, you get the point. It's the physical aspects and not it. But I'm just saying people sense immediately. And so there it is. It's built in that there will be no encouragement to observe the obvious, to note the obvious from the mainstream of life. It is not possible. The more intelligent, the more sophisticated, the more educated are the people in any particular time and place, the less ability they have to look and just note the obvious. Now, it used to be an old definition of what an intellectual was, a man who could throw a rock and miss the ground. I sense a certain kind of anti-intellectualism in that joke. That's why I attribute it to someone else. That is that they simply cannot deal with the obvious. That is true. But back to the question, which I wanted you to see has personal pertinence to a few people. Obviously not the mainstream. Obviously not hardly anybody on this planet. But such is my potential audience anyway, I've about come to accept. You know how it feels to be beaten out night after night by nude, overweight Polish roller derby backwards, or the crossword puzzle working championships every night. I was trying to think, that's not bad. Two people sitting there working. The question is, why can the obvious not be noted? And I admit I intended it finally to point out one that at least you had some potential to get your interest inflamed for a second, because the idea of crime and always blaming on a group of people has always been true. But you could blame other things. But there's simply things going on to the ordinary mind externally that people find offensive. They believe is a drawback. It could be that the interest rates. It could be all kinds of things that people think, well, if they would make me head of the feds for one day. Now, I'm not even an economist. And of course, all he's got is this view, which could be valid and represent a large segment of his particular time and place, that if I were chairman of the Fed, I would, and I don't know what to make up, he would enact something that, of course, would benefit not only the guy speaking, but he would be, if he actually had some valid noticeability to it, would affect some large segment of people that would be a true comment. If we would stop the banks, all right, if we put a cap on interest rates for credit cards, for consumer credit, if we put a cap for the next 5 years of 8%, that would cut down on the bankruptcies. That would cut down on so many of the middle class and the lower middle classes from losing their homes. Well, it's true. Big deal. But is anybody going to accept that? It is absolutely a fact. It would cut down bankruptcies, but there'd be less people losing their homes. Is it going to happen? No. Because it would assume it would apparently cure one thing. You're apparently cutting out what he saw to be a bad spot on an apple, a drawback to financial health or growth, at least the way he looked at it. But if you did that, it would do more harm than good, is the point. It will not happen. And if somebody did stand up, if somebody at some sort of economic summit managed to jump up from the audience and holler, well, you people are just talking that same old kind of stuff that even economists don't understand. You just make up. No, but you don't know what you're doing. Why don't you do something decent for the rest of us? Why don't you put a cap on consumer credit rates and don't let any bank in this country for the next 5 years charge over 8% interest? Why don't you do that? Everybody in the audience sitting there, the middle class, people, I'm calling it an economic conference, people that have some expertise or some education in economics, they sit there in the audience, the middle class, they know that's true, but they also immediately know that that wasn't one of us that stood up and said that. You can't stop and say things like that. They don't sit there and analyze it, but you understand they don't have to look around the back to see if indeed he's barefooted and wearing a straw hat, got shit on the bottom of his feet, he just came in from a barnyard. They don't have to. They know that he's the fringe element, or he wouldn't have stood up and said that. So therefore, they might finally gradually look around just to see how soon it took the guard to come find whoever that was and take him out. And just everybody goes, and whoever the speaker was, they say, well, pardon the interruption. Were there any real questions? What do you mean? Is anybody going to ask something that doesn't have anything to do with a very blunt pointing out of the obvious? Could we have some real questions? Yeah, right. Could we have some real observations? Something that would benefit us all, be worthwhile. Which is a secret way life. People don't know it, but it's life's way, again speaking in conspiratorial code terms, of saying, does anybody have anything to say that's not so damn obvious? But it sounds like better to say something with a little more intellectual depth to it. I mean, we don't. How'd the man get in here, the speaker would say, and everybody goes, phew. But what he said was true as hell. Yeah. I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on. This was a serious meeting. The point is, the observation wasn't serious. It wasn't worthwhile. It had no meaning. It had no validity. Sure it did. Your mind, let me be more specific. Your thoughts, the thoughts that run through your head, that run through what I'm sure that some of you still call your mind, but these things that run through, there are things that your own mind, that is the thoughts that you take as being you. This is the unanalyzed, uncodified sensation of non-stop electrical energy, and you take it in toto, you take it over a long period of time, these thoughts as being you. But that's how you identify. Anyway, it's you. But part of what goes on, the you, is like my mainstream in the audience of the economic convention or listening to this political speech, this candidate. There are thoughts that run through that will point out the obvious, and your thoughts, your ordinary thoughts, or your mind, it seems to be you interpreting the thoughts, or periodically stop and go, oh. It will not stop for those any more than for, oh. And as quick as I said, the audience would immediately dismiss the guy who stood up and pointed out the obvious. You simply look off. Life will not allow you to look at the obvious. And if I need to say this, by the way, me saying, picking out groups of people or something and say that life won't let you see the obvious, this has nothing whatsoever friggin' ever to do with any group of people. It's got nothing to do with that. It's not got anything to do with any profession or any religious group. It's got nothing to do with any group of people. That's just the example to point out. What it has to do with is life will not let thoughts, the ordinary thoughts of man, note the obvious, whatever it is, because if you note the obvious, you're only a short spit, let us say, from the general area where the secret is known to hang around. Didn't want to say it, but you forced it out of me. Life is not going to, for several reasons. That's the more expansive explanation of why life will not let you do it. But the other one, I still sense that not everyone saw that to which I was pointing. Life will not let man in general note the obvious of what's going on. Because if you noted the obvious, it would, I've been polite tonight, or been understating it, it would hinder the progress of humanity in general. That's the nice way of putting it. It's not going to happen, so I can put it the nice way, or since it's not going to happen, I can put it a more blunt way, that if everybody, if all the mainstream began to note the obviousness of life, as I've pointed out before, life would stop. The life of man, the progress of man would stop. And that would just be a short period of time and we would all be back living as chimpanzees or attorneys or something horrible. You cannot rely on the obvious if you're ordinary. The human mind, ordinary consciousness, cannot survive on the obvious because the obvious is conclusive. And the mind will not continue. The thoughts will not continue to run if you suddenly could grab a man and make him, if you could take a man and force the secret right in his head, try this again, because all of you, I know in your own way sometimes you go, yeah. If you could do that to a man, even a man standing there and said, all my life I've been studying all kinds of mystical and weird activities, and you keep talking about the secret, you know, if you know what it is, or could you put it on me? And if somebody knew the secret, and you had to put it on, and they did it to a man, you do know it would have done him no good. And that's a severe understatement. It would have ruined him. I mean, he would become part of the fringe element. He would end up in worse shape than he was. He would literally end up outside the mainstream of life because it would incapacitate him. That is what would happen, everything being equal as it is now, if large numbers of people, or if all the mainstream suddenly started noting the obvious. It wouldn't even have to be that all of humanity suddenly saw the great mystical secret. Not that. Just that every day, let's say it might take a week, that all the mainstream on planet Earth right now, that all of the ordinary, decent, square, middle-class people on this planet, I think a week, I'll stick with that. Just that over this period of a week, that people, just everybody, news commentators, your mother, the guy on the street, just everybody began to take notice of the obvious. And when I say take notice, of course they would have to mention it. They take notice of the obvious. People working in a store, 7-Eleven, somebody comes in and goes, blah, 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 and the guy just points out the obvious in response to his comment. Or a politician makes a comment. The reporter points out the obvious. A reporter writes a story about a politician. A guy stops me at a bar later after the paper comes out and points out the obvious about what the reporter did. And then the bartender turns to the guy that just pointed out what he did, that everybody, understand, just started turning around to everybody and started noting the obvious first themselves. But when I say noted the obvious, also, if circumstances permitted, mention it. I'd give it a week. And God, you'd be sorry it ever happened. Because life as we know it on this planet would absolutely crumble. It would fall apart. The obvious, and it doesn't matter what it is, As I said, it has nothing to do with a group of people. It has nothing to do with laying blame. I'm just saying that there are things going on in life that the mind says, how can we explain this? And somebody will say, well, that's easy to explain. Here's what's causing it. And it's only up to life, if life has determined at that period of time that this is too obvious. This would be a hindrance to you group of people continuing along and making some progress until further notice. This would tend to bring things to a severe retard, if not an absolute halt. And one way to tell this also is the mainstream will never note whatever it is. That will only come from the fringe elements. Of course, that doesn't mean that all fringe elements are telling the truth, because you can have some fringe element guy staying up hollering, I'm Napoleon. You know, and he could be 6'3". So I think that, that would belie the fact of a man in the fringe element noting the obvious. So you could discount that. See, one doesn't prove the other. Just because he's fringe element doesn't mean the man's saying the truth or pointing out the obvious. But what I'm saying is, if somebody points out the obvious and you hear it and it almost makes you tingle like, good God, that is true. And you think, who said that? You don't have to look. Assuming, again, you're middle class and ordinary, you know it wasn't anybody next to you. Of course, you're hoping, God, I didn't get drunk and say it myself, did I? Anyway, you don't have to look, because you know it's somebody way off there at the edge of the parade, probably up on the sidewalk or in the gutter. You know it is, because life will not allow it. Now consider what runs your own thoughts. This really gets tricky, because then I can make it sound like, well, your thoughts, what you notice about what goes on in your own consciousness, your own thoughts, you will not take note of the obvious going on. If I was a dirty mule skinner, say, I'd leave it at that and say, tune in next week when Buck Rogers attacks Ming directly, leaps at his little scrawny throat. In fact, it was the first time it wasn't noticed back then, because the original serials were in black and white and people couldn't translate the verbiage, but it was Buck who first grabbed Ming, and that was the first time that one man called another on film a pencil-neck geek. See, many people attribute that to professional wrestling, but it was not true. Black and white serials, which don't anybody write me about Post or Kellogg's. I could leave it there and say what is pertinent to you individually is that you cannot take note of the obviousness inherent in what you think. That's child's play. Oh, it's true that ordinary people do not know what's going on with their thoughts. You ask them if they do, and if they're sane, they're going to say, yeah. And look at you like, are you insane? But they don't. And if you don't know that, all it tells me is everything I need to know about you. If you believe that the world's leading psychiatrist, the world's leading psychologist, the world's leading neurologist, those involved in groups, committees, whole departments now involved with brain research trying to ascertain exactly what is human consciousness. The experts in their field, if you think that they know what goes on in their mind, it tells me one thing, not about them. It tells me that you don't even have a clue is what goes on in your mind. They don't know. They're not even close. This is just a little harmless hobby. Better they do that than hold up 7-Eleven stores or park in our handicapped places and make us walk further. But back to where I said I could leave it at a dirty part. Extremely, unusually viscid. Where I given to such glutinous behavior. Would be to say that men do not recognize in their own thoughts how their own thoughts, just in passing, will note the obvious, that they will not themselves note what is obviously noted by their thoughts. That would sound complex, sticky indeed, but that's not it. If you got involved with that, then you're stuck the rest of your life trying to analyze your thoughts, which I hate to keep even sounding theatrically insulting, but anybody who spends their life analyzing their thoughts If I had more of you further on in the train, you know I don't have to say anything after that. Just think, analyze your thoughts. It's like Socrates' and idea, that whole idea. An unexamined life is not worth living. True. But if it took you to examine your life more than 5 minutes, your life ain't worth living anyway, or at least it ain't worth talking about. I don't hear about it. For a man to say, yes, well, I've been analyzing my thoughts now in my own mind for now on to 25 years. And someone over here goes, hey, I've been doing it 35. And they feel like he's bragging. They don't understand that. It's ordinary people again. This guy thinks, well, hey, he stands taller. I've been doing it 35. And you say, well, what are you sticking out your chest for? You should be hiding under the guy that did it for 25. And think, well, at least I'm not, let him protect you. The dastardly part. Here we go. I'm going to wrap it up. Here's the dastardly part. It's not. It might sound like a good ending. It is not. Oh. Already out? Oh, watch it. It would sound like there could be an ending of me pointing out what I did. That part of the conspiracy is that people never notice, flowing through their own thoughts, just going on constantly, that interspersed in there with ordinary, sane, square, middle class, mainstream people are thoughts that note the obvious, the very thing that life conspires, that life is arranged to keep you from doing, and you don't notice it. That, there's a conspiracy of never noticing the obvious. Child's play. What you don't notice, the obvious thing that you don't notice, is that your thoughts have nothing to do with you, and that there is nothing to analyze. That is the conspiracy. Because as long as life can make everyone take their own thoughts, whenever need be, to take their own thoughts personally, to defend them, to excuse them, to feel guilty about them, it's got nothing else to worry about. And as long as you do that, it tells me one thing. You could have been thinking you're involved with such as this for a lifetime, and you haven't even got a clue as to what's going on. You may enjoy hearing me talk. There's nowhere to go. Go home, sit in the closet, close the door, turn out the light, and there it is. And you can go, what? I think, well, shit. I was afraid of that.